Thank you. Let's go to questions from our audience now. If you'll raise your hand, please, and wait for the microphone, I will call on you. Let's take this gentleman here. No, please wait for the microphone.
Hello? Working? Okay. All right. Margaret and Peter asked about, or said something about the readers not understanding what is going on in the newspaper when they put in terms like anonymous sources and the one about the reporting from the
Dateline.
Dateline, yeah. And did you ever think about, maybe for a while, putting in a preamble to the story to explain some of the terms that people are ignorant of? Because it might be very easy to get them to understand what's going on.
Yeah, it's a great question. We're actually in the middle of a redesign of our website right now where they're planning to make some changes that will hopefully put a little more clarity and transparency on some of these things. Not maybe exactly a preamble like you're talking about, but they're going to put pictures of the reporters and they're going to put a little bio, who the reporter is, where they're coming from, trying to explain things. And I think you're right. We need to find more ways to do that. The Post did a great job during the Roy Moore story last year of making clear how they came to get that story. They didn't, it wasn't just dropped on their lap by a political operative. They found it because a reporter happened to, talk to somebody who mentioned this offhand, and the reporters went and pursued the story. And I think that kind of transparency is very helpful because I think it demystifies the assumptions that people have about the media. I'm stunned at the people, including reporters, by the way. We all look at the front page or home page or the TV news and say, well, that story is obviously planted by so-and-so, or this story is timed this way because it serves so-and-so's interest. And it really could just be that guy was at a party last night and happened to run into somebody completely randomly who told him something. Our processes are not very good at helping readers understand where our stories come from. And you're right. I think ideas like that we should think about more.
And to that point, I want to tell you about something that Margaret and I and everyone on the White House Correspondents Association are very excited about, because it goes to this issue of what do we do and how do we do it and what's the cumulative value of what we do covering the White House. 3 years ago, Margaret and I had breakfast and we came up with this idea because we had two colleagues who had kept every pool report. The pool report is the hour-by-hour report produced by journalists who cover the president every day. So let's say the president walks up from the Oval Office to the helicopter. The helicopter takes off to Andrews. There's a pool report filed on that movement. At this moment, the president wearing this, took a question, didn't take a question, waved, whatever. Then there's somebody at Andrews. When the helicopter lands, the president gets on the plane, there's a pool report written about that. Every single movement, everything's said. We just said, the Correspondents Association has just created a cooperation with the University of Maryland and the Museum. And we are going to create a digital archive of pool reports of every president back to George W. Bush from 9/11 forward. And then every pool report filed prospectively. It will be the largest collection of this hour-by-hour, day-by-day journalism of the presidency of the United States and the history of our country. It will be searchable by everyone. Historians, political scientists, political operatives, the public, journalists. And it's going to represent, it's going to show people what we do, how we do it, what's it look like, how's it read, and what's the value of it cumulatively. And having just finished a book on the first year of the Trump presidency, I found myself going back to pool reports routinely, even though I was there, just to remind myself exactly what happened and when, down to the minute. This is another way that the Correspondents Association is trying to elevate the awareness of just how we go about this work. And not only do that, but make it a tool available to anyone who's curious about the American presidency. And that's something we could not be more excited about, and we just announced it this week, so we're happy about that.
Making news right and left. Next question. Let's go to this lady in here. Wait for the microphone.
I just wanted to ask whether you guys think that social media plays a good or a bad role when it comes to journalism, and what we as readers can do to kind of use social media to differentiate between true and false news.
Good question. Good. Yes?
I'll try.
Okay.
That's hard. I think it's both good and bad. Definitely, Twitter, as Dan was referring to, can put you into a bubble, especially reporters. We all sometimes people say that we're just trying to write news so that our colleagues who follow us on Twitter will all tweet it and everything like that. And I mean, if you go anywhere outside of Washington, a lot of people don't use Twitter because it's just too much to handle, and they use other social media or something like that. I definitely think it's useful for me as somebody who covers the media to know what these people are doing all the time and what they're tweeting, so I definitely follow it very closely, and it's great for politicians as well to get the message out without having to go through us, and kind of, as the president says himself, to speak directly to the people. So that's great for him. It can be very hard for an average consumer to understand how to handle social media because there's so much of it, there's so many different outlets, there's a lot to, it's hard to understand kind of what, like you said, like what's a legitimate outlet, what's not, who's a good person to follow on social media because, you know, they tweet good insights and who's not. A lot of it just comes from experience, like it takes time from culling it yourself. A kind of a practical thing I like to tell people is if they want to get into Twitter, that's great, is to start small and follow a few good organizations like newspapers that you already read or personalities that you know, like Dan Balz on Twitter or something like that. Follow him and then look at who he follows or look at the list that he might have created on his social media page and say, okay, this is what he sees in his feed every day. And a little bit of a tangent, another thing that I really love about social media is, like I said, we often find ourselves in our bubbles, and you can, you follow your friends and you follow news organizations you follow, and as a result, you're not seeing what somebody who might have a different point of view is seeing. If somebody is a member of the NRA and supports certain causes, their social media feed probably looks much different than somebody who attended the Students' March last week or, bought one of those pink hats on Inauguration Day. There is a program from the Wall Street Journal called Red Feed, Blue Feed that you can log into and see what a feed would look like if you followed a bunch of conservative places and if you followed a bunch of liberal places. And it is fascinating. I'll often go on there when big news breaks and just to go see how it's playing out. And it is sometimes mind-blowing to see how people can live in different worlds. So I highly recommend also, if you yourself are of a certain persuasion, follow an organization or a person who you think is the exact opposite of you, who frustrates you every day, and just follow them and see what they say. And it can be, I think, mind-opening a little bit.
Mark Zuckerberg is going to be testifying before Congress next week. Facebook is certainly having some difficulties. I think the last panel talked about a public relations nightmare or something like that. Clarence, you've been following some of this. What do you think we can expect? Regulation? What can we expect is going to happen?
Well, it's interesting to me that Zuckerberg has agreed to appear. Members of Congress have been trying to get him up there for years, and he's been able to dodge it so far and send some underling. You can tell he's really in deep you-know-what this time because he cannot dodge it. He's getting a lot of negative blowback over really what's the controversy boiled down to? A lot of us Facebook users are discovering all of a sudden that our metadata has been sold out there without our consent. And I think those three words are important ones, without our consent. I think that's what really bugs people the most about this. And there's always been some suspicion about Facebook and all of this from my wife to everybody else on the planet about what is this really all about. But boy, it sure is fun getting reunited with my high school friends again. Facebook is part of our lives now. There's a debate over should we make it a public utility? Should it be, because it's so much a part of our lives, just like the telephone became so much a part of our lives. And that's I think the debate going on underneath what's happening on the surface. What's intriguing to me is now we've got Mark Zuckerberg, who we know traditionally, he's an engineer, very bright, obviously, very innovative, and the kind of guy who's always testing the limits and then apologizing later and pulling back. This is about his dozenth major apology that's been counted in the last dozen years. But like I say, he's got more negative blowback than usual this time, and now people are more and more concerned about just how much of my interest is Facebook and these other big social media companies taking into consideration versus are they just doing their thing until they get called back? And that's where the regulation question comes in, which brings up the next question. Do members of Congress know enough about how Facebook works to write regulations for it? And by the time they do figure out how it works, will the regulations be obsolete? That's what we've seen happen over the last decade or two.
The last panel addressed that very well, and they believe me, they know what to do. Other thoughts about Facebook?
Well, all I wanted to say, and I'll try to be brief about it, is that every generation is the age of something, and a century ago, right, it was like the Industrial Revolution, the Industrial Age. Maybe you could argue during the war era, it was antibiotics. Maybe we're all alive because of evolutions in medicine. The Cold War was a whole other thing. But I think for this generation, one of the big defining developments of our time is data, and the way data is shared, and just the volume and intensity with which you can receive and sort and use information. And on the one hand, that's given us all a bigger mandate and more potential power to reach people. And on the other hand, it's complicated the ability for the media to be the source, because everybody can be a media outlet in another sense. And so we all already know that. That's no great revelation, but everything we're talking about has to be seen through the lens of that. Data is the story of our age, and everything and everyone who has sought to lasso that, from our current president to all of us and our bosses, is contending with these huge, massive, sweeping forces that are unleashed because of the technological developments. And a lot of the issues that we're struggling with, like reader distrust or Facebook, whether foreign governments can abuse that or whatever, has to do with this technology that is much bigger than any of us. And I think to that extent, we're all in this together to try to figure it out.
Great. Our time is running out. Do we have some more questions? Here in the front row, please. A microphone here. Thank you.
An observation, then I'll try to turn into a question. For fun, I look at a lot of different newspapers and periodicals, and I think this goes to your point. If you look at the articles, they're the mainstream media, and Fox or wherever else, Wall Street Journal, the reporting in the article is fairly similar. Where it changes is the headline. And if you want to have a little fun, look at an article on the New York Times or the Washington Post and look at the headline, or look at the headline and how it's portrayed in the Wall Street Journal. And a lot of people only read headlines. And that's, if you want to talk about something to be informative, maybe work on your headline writers. And that goes to the transparency that Chris was talking about at least.
The President of the United States just did that the other day. He offered an alternative headline for Dan's newspaper. He said, this headline's wrong, and it should have said this. And the irony is that everybody's a headline writer. The irony is that headline that he said was wrong was not factually wrong in any way. He just chose to see the story through this side of the lens rather than that side of the lens. And you're right, headlines, and I'll tell you this, and I don't mean to, but headline writers deserve a big raise, because it is the hardest thing in the world to get a headline right. Margaret has, we have 1,000 words or whatever to try to get the subtleties and the nuances of a story right, make sure every side is represented as best we can. Those guys have, 7 words, right? And people doing it for print format have to make it fit, in our case, very narrow columns. And to be able to capture the nuance of a story without seeming to tilt one side is a very tricky thing. And more they're asking reporters to do this, and having now experienced this, I can tell you, it's a bear. It's a terror.
But there's another phenomenon that is completely related to the digital experience, which is when I came up in the newspaper business, as did Peter and Dan, headline writers for the newspaper had a certain construct and a certain space and a certain mandate that had nothing to do with search engine optimization. All right, search engine optimization is anchor words in the headline that are most likely to generate the most clicks, okay? And that has fundamentally changed, not only the editorial content, but the construct and the mission and the motive of a headline. And that, I would not say, has been a altogether clean or fortuitous turn in headline writing, because it elevates clickability over some of these more fundamental, nuanced, accuracy. They're not inaccurate, but they can tend to dramatize things in a way that are likely to catch more eyes and catch more clicks. Now, one thing that's changing in the industry is, for the last 10 years, the industry, as it transitioned from print to digital, kept assuming that more clicks would create more digital ad revenue. That was the assumption. It's been proven largely false. More clicks per story don't impress digital advertisers. Relationships impress digital advertisers. Substantial eyeballs on a page impresses digital. So what you have to have is sustained coverage that creates a relationship that builds trust, credibility, and so subscriptions and long-term viewing are now much more valuable to digital advertisers, and they will pay a higher premium for that, whereas 5 or 10 years ago, the assumption was the more clicks we have, and I worked in a newsroom, and I'm sure Peter and Dan did, where for a while there was this TV screen that measured every reporter's story by the hour, by the clicks. Happily, those have gone away, because this relationship mode has now become a much more long-term and sustainable business mode.
We have just about 2 minutes left, so I want to do a lightning round here of what the future holds. Do we think that the situation we're in now is a brief phenomenon, or is this a permanent state? And Dan, will you start us off?
Well, I think that we are in, as I said earlier, a very unusual moment. But I also think that there are deeper things about this moment that are going to endure, whether Donald Trump is in the White House after 2020 or not. And so I think that the challenges for the media are going to continue almost irregardless of whether President Trump maintains the power that he has at this point.
Yeah, not permanent, but will definitely have an impact for years going forward.
I guess I would say a note of caution and a note of hope. So on the one hand, I think that the issues we're talking about with the media are issues that all elite institutions are facing. And this is, I think, is partially the product of dramatic centralization over the last century. We talked about local newspapers going away. There's much more trust there. So we have to think about that, not just with relation to media, but with all kinds of different institutions. So that's the challenge. The note of hope, though, and I tell people in my organization this all the time, which is, and this I think is the hopeful thing for some of these media organizations, is when you look at a crooked stick, it's not helpful to argue over whether or not it's crooked. Just lay a straight stick next to it. And if media organizations want to be successful, just be the straight stick. People will figure that out.
I like that advice. A lot of things I could say. I think one thing that I do see happening is, or expect to happen, is more tribalization of our media and our media audiences, meaning demographics are going to mean more and more all the time. I wouldn't have thought a movie like Black Panther with an all-black cast was going to be breaking box office records globally. But that's how much the world has changed now. It just opened in Saudi Arabia, the first theater movie there in, I think, history, or the history of the Saudi regime as we know it. And this is happening in our politics now. I told you I reread Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, every few years. Those who've read it know what I mean. It came out in 1984, prophetically enough, and it's all about how entertainment values are corrupting TV, well, journalism, but particularly television journalism. And it's happened now. We have our first TV president, our first reality TV president, who used TV values to win enough of the nation's hearts, to win enough electoral votes to get into the White House. I think even he was surprised by his success. But what happens when you get somebody who's just a little notch more knowledgeable, a little bit more slick about being able to sell themselves through the media? Is traditional, a guy like Abraham Lincoln, tall, lanky, with a voice that was kind of like this, according to reports, would he be able to make it in the TV age now, like the tall, lanky, deep-voiced Barack Obama? The media are having an impact on our politics that cannot be denied, and I think we're just beginning to understand it.
Thank you.
In a purely journalistic sense, every existential question should be answered by existing first. You have to exist. If you don't have any shelter, if you don't have any food and have any water, you've got to get shelter, food, and water. You've got to exist. You've got to focus on the fundamentals. Local journalism has to exist. Journalists who practice the trade have to do it right every single day, over and over and over. You have to exist first. Second thing I would point out is the millennial generation is going to have a lot to say about this. I have 3 children, 23, 21, and 17. Their social media habits are adapting and changing every single day. They are not the same that they were 4 years ago, and they're not going to be the same 4 years from now. And the millennial generation affects us culturally, it affects us the way we talk, the way we look at things, safe spaces, trigger, points, all sorts of notions about how to connect, what connectedness feels, what's real, what's not believable. My kids, through my entire life as a journalist, always ask me, how do you do it? They've watched me do it, they still don't know how I do it, okay? But they're going to have a very big say in all of these underlying fundamental issues. So the first thing we have to do is exist, and the second thing we have to do is adapt as our audience adapts.
I think in this information age, information is something that everybody expects, demands, counts on, and to some extent takes for granted. And it's the last part that worries me, and it's the rest of it that gives me hope, because I think the most important thing for all of us to do is to reconnect people to the idea that we, the press, are there to serve you, the American public, who deserves and craves information that you can use to help you get the most out of your government, demand changes when you need it, and make decisions about your life. I think rebuilding trust is to remind people that the First Amendment is about them, not about us, and is about democracy and being an American, and not about business models. So it's a small task that I'm chipping away at a little bit, piece by piece.
And Peter Baker,
Boy, that was
last
so
word.
good. I don't want to follow that. That's terrible. I'm an optimist. I think this is obviously an extraordinary moment for journalism right now, but it's an extraordinary moment that President Trump has maybe accelerated or exacerbated or accentuated, but it's something that was changing anyway. Our media has been changing. It would have been changing no matter who was president. Will continue to change after he's gone. And it's a period of creative destruction, and we're focusing a lot on the destruction. But there's also, I think, I'm an optimist. I'm also very excited by the creativity. We have organizations today that are meaningful, important, significant journalistic organizations that did not exist 10 years ago. And while we're losing an awful lot, we're also gaining an awful lot. And I love watching how the next generation, how Major's kids and our kids are going to reinvent journalism and bring it to a new era. And I think that we all ought to feel good about that.
So for all those students out there, this is a great time to be getting into journalism. We wish you every success. Thank you to the panel. Please join me.